There is a particular silence that falls over a crowd when someone decides out loud that you are the problem. It is not the silence of shock. It is the silence of agreement being confirmed. 37 people stood on that back porch in the honeyed light of a Tennessee evening, and when my mother-in-law lifted one manicured finger and aimed it at my face, not a single one of them made a sound. Not my wife, not her father, not the cousin still chewing a cookie. The lake behind them went on doing what lakes do, indifferent and beautiful, and I stood there in a borrowed silence that had been 11 years in the making. And I understood something with the clarity of a man who has just been handed a diagnosis. They had been waiting for this, perhaps for years, and I had been waiting too. Though I hadn't known it until that exact moment, the way you don't know you've been holding your breath until someone opens a window. I smiled. I have been told since that the smile was the frightening part. If you have ever been the person in the room that the room decided not to see, stay with me through this one. Hit that like button and subscribe to my channel, because the story I'm about to tell you is not really about revenge, though I will use that word before we're done. It's about the difference between being patient and being erased, and about how long a decent man can confuse the two. My name is Marcus Bellamy. I was 43 that summer, and I had been married to Diane Whitfield for 11 years, 4 months, and an unremarkable number of days that I could not have told you at the time, and can tell you now with an accuracy that says something unflattering about how a mind processes an ending. I built things, not with my hands, though I'd used them plenty, but with structure, with patience, with the unglamorous discipline of showing up. Bellamy Property Group had 12 employees, 43 properties under management, and a balance sheet that would have made any of the Whitfields choke on their iced tea if they had ever once asked to see it. They never asked. That is, I think, the whole story in a sentence, but you deserve the longer version. I want you to understand who I was before that porch, because otherwise who I became afterward will look like cruelty rather than what it actually was, which was arithmetic. I fixed Harold Whitfield's basement in the summer of the 4th year. 16 hours of my own labor across a weekend, kneeling in 3 inches of standing water in a crawl space that smelled like a grave, sealing a foundation crack that a contractor had quoted at $4,000. Harold thanked me by telling his golf partners that he'd finally gotten around to sorting it out himself. I drove Lily, Diane's youngest sister, 3 hours to the airport at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, because her flight was cheap and nobody else answered the phone. I attended 14 consecutive family reunions. 14. I counted, which should tell you that some part of me had been keeping a ledger long before I admitted it. And in all that time, across all those years, I do not believe Margaret Whitfield ever once asked me a question about myself that she wanted the answer to. The first time I understood what I had married into was at my own wedding, which is a thing I've never said out loud to anyone until now. Not during the ceremony. Diane was luminous that day, genuinely, and I have never in my life regretted marrying her, which is a sentence that has cost me a great deal to keep saying honestly. It was at the reception, past 11, when the good bourbon had done its work, and the room had loosened into the honesty that alcohol mistakes for courage. I was standing near the bar, and Margaret was 3 feet behind me with her back turned, talking to her sister, and she did not know I was there. She could have had anyone, Margaret said. Her sister said something I didn't catch. "Oh, he's fine," Margaret said. "He's perfectly fine." That's exactly what I mean. I stood there in my rented tuxedo, holding a drink I no longer wanted, and I made a decision that I would spend the next 11 years defending. I decided not to hear it. I decided that it was late, that she'd had a difficult day, that mothers say things about the men who take their daughters away, and that the generous interpretation was the correct one, because the generous interpretation was the one that let me stay married without a war. I want to be precise about something here, because it matters more than any of the ugliness that comes later. That decision was not weakness. I've heard people say it was, in the comments, in the retellings, in the way men talk about other men who tolerated things. It was not weakness, it was a bet. I bet that if I was good enough for long enough, they would eventually see me. Every year I put another chip down. Every basement, every airport run, every reunion, every swallowed comment, the house always wins. That's the thing about a bet like that. The house doesn't have to cheat. It just has to wait. There was one more thing from those early years that I need you to hold on to, because it will matter when we get to the porch. And if I don't plant it now, you will not believe the shape of what grew from it. The 9th year, February. Harold called me at my office, which he had never done. He was warm in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up, asked about the business, asked about my parents, asked about a golf tournament I had mentioned once, 4 years earlier, and remembered wrong. And then, with the elaborate casualness of a man who has rehearsed, he mentioned that the lake house had a balloon payment coming due, that the refinancing hadn't gone the way he'd expected, that it was nothing really, a temporary compression, but that if a person had liquidity and wanted to make a family investment, well, he never said a number. That was the trick of it. He needed me to say the number so that afterward in the retelling, it would be my idea. I said no. I said it kindly, and I said it with an offer attached. I told him I would sit down with his lender, look at the terms, restructure the note, find him $30,000 or $40,000 in interest over the life of the loan, and that I'd do it for free that weekend if he wanted. I told him the truth, which was that lending money inside a family is how you find out what the family actually thinks of you, and that I loved him enough not to do that to us. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Well, that's very professional of you, Marcus," in a voice I had heard him use with waiters. He never mentioned it again, neither did I, and for 2 years I told myself that had been the end of it. It was not the end of it. It was the beginning of the file they kept on me. The Whitfield reunion happened every summer at the lake house outside Maynardville, Tennessee, on a finger of Norris Lake 40 minutes from anything resembling a town. Bad cell service, one bathroom in the main house, one in the guest cabin, and 30-some people who had opinions about both. It was a genuinely beautiful property. I want to be fair to it. The water went silver at dusk, and there was a stand of loblolly pines that made a sound in the wind like distant applause. Beautiful places and family gatherings have a strange relationship. The beauty doesn't soften anything. It just gives the ugliness a better frame. Diane had been talking about that particular reunion for 6 weeks. "It'll be good," she kept saying. "Everyone's been asking about you." "Have they?" I said. "Renata asked if you were coming." Renata was Diane's older sister who had once informed me at a Thanksgiving table, while refilling her own wineglass, that I had done remarkably well for a man without a graduate degree. She had said it the way you'd compliment a dog for climbing stairs. "Can't wait," I said. Diane gave me a look. I want to describe that look properly because I have thought about it more than I have thought about almost anything else from that summer. It was not anger. It was not exasperation. It was preemptive. It was the look of a woman already apologizing to her family for something I had not yet done. And I had been receiving that look for so many years that I had stopped noticing it was an accusation. I gave her back the smile that said I always behave. And I did, God help me, I always did. The drive up on that Friday evening was the best part of the entire weekend, and I say that without irony. Windows down, her hand on my knee, some old song on the radio that we both knew the words to and both pretended not to. Somewhere south of Corbin, she laughed at something I said and put her head back against the seat, and I remember thinking, with the uncomplicated stupidity of a happy man, "We're all right. Whatever this is, we're all right." I have replayed that hour more times than is good for me. Not because it was a lie. Because it wasn't. Lily heard the car and came running down from the dock screaming both our names, 24 years old, and already 3 seltzers into an evening that hadn't officially started. I caught her mid-launch and spun her once, the way I'd done since she was 13, and I was the new boyfriend who didn't know yet what he was walking into. "You started without us," I said. "I started it for you," she said, grinning. Behind her, the rest of them assembled out of the dusk. Harold and Margaret, Renata and her husband Preston, who had the permanently apologetic posture of a man who had learned exactly how much of himself he was allowed to keep. Diane's brother Trevor with his girlfriend Nora, cousins, aunts, uncles, a rotating cast of Whitfields I had spent a decade failing to keep straight. And Cody, Diane's cousin, 29 years old, unemployed since an incident he referred to as a restructuring. And somehow always the most relaxed person in any room he entered. He had the ease of a man who had never once been genuinely inconvenienced by his own choices, which I found less irritating than instructive. I shook hands. I hugged necks. I made the small talk. I was good at it. 11 years of practice makes a man good at almost anything, including being nobody. "Marcus." Margaret came at me with her signature smile, the one that reached her eyes just far enough to technically qualify. "You made it. wouldn't miss it. She patted my arm once. Light, brief. The way you pat a piece of furniture you're still deciding whether to keep or sell. That was the most warmth I received from her in 3 days. I didn't know that yet. But some animal part of me must have, because I remember the exact texture of that pat. And I could not tell you what I ate for dinner that night. Here is the thing about contempt inside a family. It does not arrive as an event, it arrives as weather. It comes in 1,000 small pieces, each of them individually deniable, each of them small enough that objecting to it would make you the unreasonable one. That is not an accident. That is the architecture. Saturday morning. Breakfast on the back porch, the whole crowd of us at a long table. Margaret's famous biscuits and a sausage casserole that people talked about the way other families talk about heirlooms. She came around the table with the coffee pot. Harold, Renata, Preston, Trevor, Nora, Cody, Diane. Then she went inside. I sat with an empty cup in front of me, at a table of 11 people, and the coffee pot went back to the kitchen. Preston caught my eye across the table and looked away so fast he nearly hurt himself. Nora developed an intense scholarly interest in her biscuit. Cody didn't notice, because Cody never noticed anything, which was the closest thing to innocence in that entire family. And Diane was laughing at something Renata had said, her head tipped back, genuinely delighted, entirely elsewhere. I got up, I went inside, I poured my own coffee. Margaret was standing at the counter. She looked at the pot in my hand and then at my face and she said, "Oh, did I skip you?" I'm sorry, not let me, did I? Past tense, faint curiosity, the tone of a woman confirming a crossword answer. You did, I said. She said and went back to her dishes. I have turned that syllable over in my hands 100 times since. 2 letters, there was no cruelty in it. That's what took me so long to understand. Cruelty would have been a relationship. Cruelty would have meant I mattered enough to injure. What was in that syllable was something worse and quieter. I had been assessed, years ago, filed, and there was simply no further processing required. Saturday afternoon the men were on the dock, which is a phrase I use with some embarrassment, because that's exactly what it was. A formation as old and ridiculous as anything in human life. 6 men standing near water, talking about problems none of them intended to solve. Harold was describing a drainage issue on the north slope. Water pooling near the foundation. Bad grading, probably, and a French drain that had failed sometime during the Obama administration. He looked at Preston, he looked at Trevor. He looked at Cody, who had once left a ladder on a roof through an entire winter. And he asked whether any of them might have time to take a look. I said, I can look at it, Harold. I did the basement a few years back. I know how that soil sits, and I'd bet you money it's the grade and not the drain. There was a pause, a short one. 2 seconds, maybe 3. I think Preston's got more experience with this kind of thing, Harold said. Evenly, pleasantly, without hostility, as though I had not spoken, as though a bird had made a noise nearby, and the conversation had politely waited for it to finish. Preston looked at me with an expression that was 1 part apology and 3 parts relief, that it wasn't his turn to be invisible. Preston, who sold pharmaceutical software. Preston, who had once asked me what a lien was. Sure, I said. I want to mark this moment for you, because I've come to believe it was the true one. More than the porch, more than anything, Margaret said with an audience. The porch was theater. This was the actual verdict delivered on a dock by a man who wasn't even angry. It was the last time I ever offered that family anything, and none of them noticed it happen. That's what a real ending looks like. Not a slammed door, a small pleasant sentence and a man on a dock deciding he's finished. Saturday evening, dinner. The whole group, a long table out under a string of lights, the lake going dark behind us, the pines doing their applause. It was, and I will not pretend otherwise, one of the most beautiful evenings I have ever spent anywhere. Diane was glowing. These were her people, her water, her childhood. And she was so happy that she was almost a different person, a version of herself I only ever got to see out here, and I loved watching her have it. Hold on to that. I need you to hold on to that, because it matters at the end, and if you let go of it, you'll misunderstand everything that follows. Lily sat next to me. She was my buffer, and we both knew it, and neither of us had ever said so. You okay? She asked, refilling my glass without being asked. Outstanding, I said. She gave me a look that said, I see you. I gave her one back that said, I know you do, and that's the only reason I'm still at this table. The conversation moved the way it always moved. College football, property values, the unraveling marriages of people I'd never met. I was content to eat well and stay out of it, which was, I had learned, my highest available function at a Whitfield gathering. And then Cody opened his mouth. "So, Marcus," he said it loud enough that the table shifted. "Diane says the business is doing really well." I looked up. There was something in his tone that I recognized the way you recognize a chord change before you know the song. "It's going all right," I said. "What is it again? Landscaping?" The table went dead quiet because Cody knew. Every single person at that table knew what I did. Diane had talked about it at family events for years, sometimes proudly, sometimes as a complaint, but always talked. 43 properties, 12 employees, 4 years of 80-hour weeks. Property management, I said. Calmly, pleasantly. Cody nodded slowly in the specific way people nod when they want you to know they aren't impressed. Right, like mowing lawns and stuff." Renata laughed, lightly, conversationally, the way you laugh when a thing lands and you want the room to know it landed. And Diane said nothing. I looked at her. She was cutting her chicken. She had heard it. There is no version of that evening where she did not hear it, because the table had gone silent, and silence carries better than sound. She had heard it and she had made a choice, and the choice was to cut her chicken. "Sure," I said. Like that. Under the table, Lily's hand found my forearm and squeezed once, hard. She was 24 years old, and she was the only person at a table of 30 who thought a man deserved to be defended in his own presence. I didn't know it then, but that squeeze was the last piece of loyalty I would receive from anyone in that family. And it came from a girl who hadn't even been born when the rest of them decided how the world worked. Sunday was the last day, and the day it all came open. We were cleaning up after lunch in that loose, meandering way of an afternoon nobody has organized, people drifting between the dock and the lawn chairs and the kitchen. I was helping Trevor carry folding tables back to the storage shed when Renata found me. "Marcus, can I talk to you a second?" Trevor gave me a look I've thought about since. It wasn't surprise. It was the look of a man who knows the schedule. He set down his end of the table and disappeared toward the house without a word. That should have told me everything. It didn't. I was still at that point a man who believed in accidents. Renata stood with her arms crossed, wearing a yellow sundress and an expression she'd been assembling all weekend. I could see it clearly now, the way you can see brushstrokes when you finally stand at the right distance. She'd been saving this. "I want to be honest with you," she said, "because I think you deserve honesty. Let me offer you something, from one adult to another. When a person who has spent a decade communicating with you exclusively through implication announces that they are about to be honest with you, what is coming is not honesty. Honesty doesn't need an introduction. Honesty just happens. What needs an introduction is a prepared statement. "Okay," I said, "Diane isn't happy." I waited. She tries to hide it. But we can all see it. She's stressed, she's unhappy. And Renata tilted her head, a gesture of such practiced sympathy that I felt something in my chest go very cold and very calm. "We think a lot of it has to do with you." There it was. The entire weekend compressed into a single pronoun. Not I think. We think. A committee had convened. A finding had been issued. And I was receiving the summary judgment by a storage shed while holding one end of a folding table. "Renata," I said carefully, "this is between Diane and me. It stopped being between the two of you when it started affecting this family. And what exactly is it affecting?" She had a list. She'd had a list for years, I think, and she read it out to me the way a clerk reads charges. My hours, my obsession with the business, the fact that I'd never really fit in, the way I was cold with her parents, the way I made Diane defend me. I stood in the grass and listened to every word of it, and something strange happened. I stopped being angry. Anger requires a belief that the other person can be reached. What I felt instead was a kind of terrible clarity, the sensation of a fog lifting off a landscape and revealing that you are not where you thought you were, and never have been. Because here's what I understood standing there. None of it was about me. Not one item on that list. Her father was underwater on a lake house he couldn't afford and wouldn't sell. Her mother had spent 30 years constructing a family that photographed well. And I was the man who had said no once, kindly, in February of the 9th year, and had thereby committed the only unforgivable sin available in that family. I had proven I could not be needed by them, and I had proven it politely. Their contempt wasn't hatred, it was accounting. I was an asset they'd been unable to book. "I appreciate the honesty," I said, when she'd finished. I really do, and I walked away. I found Diane down by the water, standing alone looking out at the lake. I sat down on the dock beside her and let a moment go by. Renata just cornered me by the shed. Diane kept her eyes on the water. I know. Something in my chest moved a quarter inch to the left. You know, she said she wanted to talk to you. I looked at the side of her face. Diane had a profile that I had loved for a decade, a slightly stubborn chin, and a way of holding her jaw when she was deciding whether to say a thing. And you didn't think to tell me. Or I don't know, Diane, tell her not to. She's not wrong, Marcus. She said it quietly, almost gently. That was the worst part of it, the gentleness. You do work too much. You don't try with my family. My mom feels like you don't respect her. Your mother skipped my coffee cup at breakfast. In front of 11 people. She forgot. She didn't forget. Diane turned and looked at me then, and in her eyes was something I had never seen in 11 years. Not anger, not sadness, distance. She had already moved 2 steps back and was observing me from there, evaluating the way you look at a house you're thinking of listing. Maybe this weekend was supposed to help, she said slowly. Maybe if you just tried a little harder. I've been trying for 11 years. She had no answer for that. She turned back to the lake. I didn't know it then, but that was the last conversation Diane and I would ever have in which she was, in any way that meant anything, my wife. An hour later they were all on the back porch. I don't know how it assembled. These things never have a clean origin. Or rather they do, and you simply aren't invited to it. 1 minute I was in the guest room, splashing water on my face, gathering myself for 4 more hours of a weekend I had already survived worse versions of. The next I stepped outside and found 37 people arranged in the loose, dangerous formation of a group that has been talking about you and has just stopped. Margaret stepped forward. She was holding a glass of iced tea like a prop, something for her hands to do. Marcus, she said, I think we need to clear the air. I looked for Diane. She was standing with Renata. Their shoulders were touching. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because I have, not near her sister, touching her sister. In a group of 37 people, arranged in a rough half-circle, my wife had chosen where to place her body, and she had placed it on the other side of the room from mine. All right, I said. What followed was 15 minutes I have never fully described to anyone, because there are no words that carry the exact weight of being discussed, assessed, and sentenced in front of your wife's entire family, while your wife studies the floorboards. Margaret talked about respect, about family, about how they had tried so hard for so many years to include me and had found me resistant. Harold nodded at appropriate intervals, like a man on a jury who has already voted. Renata supplied color commentary. Preston looked at the lake. Trevor looked at his shoes. Lily was crying silently at the far end of the porch, and nobody looked at her either. Cody ate a cookie through the entire thing. Bless his heart. In a way, he was the most honest person present. And then Margaret said the words, Marcus, I think you have 2 choices here. She was speaking slowly now, enjoying the rhythm of it, a woman who had waited 11 years for the floor. You can apologize to this family for the way you've treated us, sincerely, and we can all move forward together. Or, and she gestured vaguely, almost delicately, toward the driveway, maybe it's best if you go. The porch went silent. I looked at Diane one last time. It took her a moment. She knew I was looking. And then, slowly, deliberately, with the terrible carefulness of someone making a decision they intend to be able to describe later as not having made, she looked at the floor. That was it. That was the whole marriage, right there, in the angle of a woman's neck. You have 2 options, Margaret said again firmly, like a judge running out of patience. Apologize, or leave. I took a breath, and I chose the third one. I smiled. I actually smiled, and I could see it land. I could see it unsettle several people in the front row of that little congregation, because a smile was not on the list of outcomes they had prepared for. They had prepared for 2, contrition or exit. Both of those were victories. Both of those were me accepting the frame. Thank you, Margaret, I said, for the clarity, and I went inside. I walked through the living room with its wall of photographs, 30 years of Whitfields at that lake, and I want to tell you something I noticed for the first time that afternoon, having walked past that wall for 11 years. I was in 2 of them, 2 out of maybe 60. In one I was a shoulder at the edge of the frame, half-cropped. In the other I was holding the camera bag. The archive had been accurate the whole time. I just hadn't read it. In the guest room I pulled out my phone. I had the airline app. 3 taps, Nashville to Chicago, a 6:45 departure, 2 hours and change from that moment. One way. I booked it before I'd finished unzipping my bag. Not because I was being dramatic, because I was being accurate. A round trip would have been a lie, and I had just discovered that I was finished lying to them and, more expensively, to myself. I packed the way I'd learned to pack across 4 years of client meetings and site visits, quickly and completely, folding with the flat calm of a man who has already made his peace and is now simply handling logistics. And here is a thing about that moment that surprised me and has never stopped surprising me. I was not sad. I would be sad later, and I want to be honest about that when we get there. But standing in that guest room, I felt the specific, disreputable lightness of a man setting down a weight he'd been assured for years was not heavy. Lily appeared in the doorway. Her face was wrecked. Marcus. Her voice was very small. What are you doing? Packing. Don't, please. Just come out and talk to them. Just say something. Just Lily. I stopped and looked at her. I'm not angry at you. I need you to know that. Whatever happens after today, I need you to know that. She pressed her lips together, and her eyes went glassy. You're one of the good ones, I said. You always were. Don't let them teach you otherwise. She crossed the room and hugged me hard, the kind of hug that is actually an apology on behalf of people who will never make one. I let her. I hugged her back, and then she said into my shoulder in a voice so quiet I nearly missed it. She knew. I went very still. What? Lily pulled back. She was 24 years old, and she had the look of someone who has just realized she is the only person in the building holding a match. Diane knew, about the porch, about all of it. She was crying properly now. Mom's been planning this for 3 weeks. Since the 4th. They called it a conversation. They said it would be a conversation. Mom said you'd fold. She said you'd apologize because you always. She stopped. Because I always do, I finished. Lily nodded, miserable, and Diane was in the room for that. Marcus? Was she in the room, Lily? Yes. I stood there in a guest room in Tennessee with a folded shirt in my hands, and 11 years reorganized themselves around me the way a word does when someone tells you you've been mispronouncing it your whole life. Every sound the same, every meaning different. I had spent an hour on that dock beside my wife, believing I was talking to a woman caught between her husband and her family. Believing she was weak. Believing, God help me, that she was suffering too. She hadn't been caught between anything. She had helped set the table. She thought it would work, Lily said desperately. She thought you'd say sorry and everyone would be nice to you afterward, and it would be better. She wasn't trying to. I know, I said. And here is the thing, the part that took me 2 years and a great deal of expensive silence to understand. I did know. That was the worst of it. Diane had not been malicious. Diane had loved me, in the way you love a difficult renovation. She had genuinely believed that if her mother broke me in public, the pieces would fit into their house better, and that she was doing it for us. She had participated in my humiliation as an act of home improvement. Malice I could have fought. Malice is a relationship. What she'd done was worse than malice, and it had a simpler name. She'd agreed with them. Tell Diane, I started. Tell her yourself. She's not going to come, Lily. Lily looked at me, and her face did something that broke a small bone somewhere in my chest, because it confirmed the last thing I still had left to lose. I'm sorry, she whispered. Don't be. You didn't do anything. I picked up my bag. You're the only one who didn't. I walked out through the living room, past the wall of photographs, through the kitchen, out the back door. They were all still on the porch. They went quiet when I came out with the bag in my hand. Margaret blinked. We're leaving, I said pleasantly. You gave me 2 options. I found a third. Marcus. That was Trevor, of all people, standing up so fast his chair went over backward. Come on, man, don't. I appreciated that. I want that on the record. Trevor Whitfield was a coward for 11 years, and then, at the very last possible second, with nothing left to save, he stood up. It didn't count for much. But I've thought about it since, and it counted for something, and I'd rather be the kind of man who says so. I looked at Diane last. She was standing very still. Her face had gone white. She was not looking at the floor anymore. She was looking directly at me, and I could see the arithmetic happening behind her eyes. In real time, the recalculation, the dawning comprehension that she had bet on a version of me that had, at some point in the last 40 minutes, ceased to exist. She opened her mouth. Diane, I said, just her name, once, like a period, like a door. Then I walked to my car, put my bag in the trunk, and drove away. I did not look in the rearview mirror. Not out of pride, and not because I was making a moment out of it. I didn't look because I already knew what was in it. Nobody was running after me. Nobody had ever been running after me. That was the entire finding of the last 11 years. And I had just been read the verdict by a woman holding a glass of iced tea. The drive to Nashville was 2 hours and 40 minutes, and I remember it as the quietest stretch of time I have experienced in my adult life. No podcast, no radio, just the highway unspooling and the sound of my own thoughts finally having room to stand up straight. The phone started at minute 9, Diane, I let it ring. Minute 19, Renata, which I found so audacious that I laughed out loud alone in a moving car. Then Margaret. That one I genuinely didn't expect, and I'll admit it landed. Margaret Whitfield had never once called me in 11 years. Not on my birthday. Not when my father died. She called me that afternoon within 30 minutes of my taillights leaving her driveway. And if you want the entire psychology of that family in a single data point, there it is. I had been worthless to them right up until the instant I became unavailable. Then Diane again, then the texts, where are you going, call me, Marcus, this is not okay. And then, after a longer pause, one word. Please. I read that one at a red light on the outskirts of Nashville, and I could hear exactly how she'd said it. That's the thing about 11 years. You learn the register. It wasn't frightened. It wasn't sorry. It was inconvenienced. It was the pleas of a woman who expected the problem to solve itself if she applied the correct tone, the way you'd address a jammed drawer. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat. I left the car in long-term parking, which felt correct. I wasn't rushing back. I sat at the gate with a bourbon in a silence so complete it had texture. And I called no one, and I texted no one. And when they called my row, I boarded. I landed at O'Hare at 8:17 in the evening. Took a cab to the office. I kept a small suite attached to it, a holdover from the years when I'd worked until 2 and slept until 5. And I let myself in and poured a glass of water and sat in the dark for a long while, listening to the building's heating system talk to itself. Then I picked up my phone and did the one thing Diane Whitfield had never, in 11 years, imagined I was capable of. I called my attorney. Rebecca Sloan had been my attorney for 6 years. She was methodical to the point of unnerving, and had spent 2 decades watching every conceivable variety of American marriage come apart in a conference room. She answered on the second ring. Marcus, it's Sunday night. I know, I'm sorry. A pause. She'd known me long enough to hear what was in the pause on my end. How bad? I need to know where I stand, I said. If I wanted to move, another pause. Then the sound of a chair and of a woman putting down a wine glass, somewhere in a house in Evanston. Tell me everything, she said. Here is what Diane didn't know. What none of them knew. And I want to be very careful about how I tell this part, because in the version her family tells, this is where I become a villain. And I've come to believe the difference between their version and mine is the most important thing in this entire story. 18 months before that reunion, I had restructured the company, not because I was planning to leave. I want to say that as plainly as I know how. I was not planning anything. I had no exit strategy, no secret account, no other woman, none of the tawdry apparatus that people assume must exist behind a decisive man. What I had was a professional habit. I build things for a living. When you build things, you learn early that the structures which survive are not the ones built for the world as it is. They're the ones built for the world as it might be at 3 in the morning during the worst week of your life. You don't put in a French drain because you expect a flood. You put it in because you've seen what water does to a foundation over 9 years of small, deniable seepage. 14 months before the reunion, Diane and I had a conversation about money. It wasn't a fight. It was worse than a fight. She had suggested, carefully over dinner, that her parents were in a spot, and that a person in my position might consider what a family is for. She used almost exactly Harold's phrasing, 5 years later, and she did not know she was doing it. I said no, kindly, with an offer of professional help attached, the same offer, unchanged. And she looked at me across our own dinner table with an expression I had seen on Margaret's face at my wedding reception. And she said, "It's just interesting to me that you're so generous with strangers." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark next to a woman I loved and I felt, for the first time, the draft. You know the one. You don't see the broken window. You just feel the temperature in a room change, and your body knows before your mind will allow it. So I did what I always do. I prepared. The company went into a clean corporate structure, solely in my name, properly capitalized, with the equity where equity belongs. Our joint accounts stayed exactly as they were, funded generously, and Diane never wanted for anything for a single day of our marriage. I paid our mortgage, I paid her car, I paid for 4 family vacations for people who couldn't be bothered to pour me coffee. And I had kept records. Not obsessively, not vindictively. But I had a habit of documentation that runs in people who build things and then have to defend them from other people's revisions. And so there was a file. Financial decisions made without my input. Requests made through Diane rather than to me. A pattern I had noticed the way you notice a hairline crack, and photographed, and filed, and told myself meant nothing. It meant something. Rebecca called me back Monday morning at 8. "You're in an extremely strong position," she said. I want to say that carefully, because I've watched a lot of men hear that sentence and get stupid. You're strong. That's not permission. That's a responsibility. What does it look like? She told me. I listened. I took notes because that's what I do. By Tuesday afternoon, papers had been filed. Diane found out Thursday, not from me. From a courier who arrived at her mother's lake house, where she had apparently remained after the reunion, which is a detail I still find remarkable, and which tells you more about that marriage than anything I could say. She hadn't gone home. 4 days, and she hadn't gone home. She had stayed at the lake, waiting, I imagine, for me to complete the sequence I had always completed. For the apology to arrive by phone, then by text, then in person, and for the family to be gracious about it afterward, and for everything to resume. My phone rang 11 times in 4 minutes. I let all 11 go to voicemail, then I sent 1 text. The only communication I initiated in that entire period. "You stood on the wrong side of the room. I won't be filing any counter-arguments." She called back instantly. This time I answered. "Marcus." Her voice was shaking. "What did you do? What needed doing?" "You filed. This is insane. Over a family argument? You're blowing up our entire life over a family argument?" "Diane." I kept my voice level, and I want you to know that keeping it level was not calm. It was the opposite of calm. It was a man holding a door shut with his whole body. This wasn't a family argument. Your family has treated me with contempt for 11 years. This weekend, they gave me an ultimatum in front of 37 people. And you stood there and watched. I was going to say something. You didn't. I just needed a minute. Diane, you knew. The silence on that line went on for a long time. "Lily," she said finally, flat. Not a question. And in that one word, the immediate identification of the leak, before any denial, before any defense, she confirmed it more completely than a confession would have. 3 weeks, I said. "You sat in a room with your mother 3 weeks ago, and you agreed to it." "It wasn't like that." Her voice cracked open. "Marcus, it wasn't like that," she said. "We thought if you never let anyone in, you never gave them away to. So the plan was to break me in front of 37 people, and see if the pieces were friendlier." "That's not fair." "No," I agreed. "It isn't. Please come back, please. We can fix this. We'll do counseling. I'll talk to my mother. I promise I'm not coming back." I said it the way I'd said 100 final things across 100 conference tables. Clear, complete, no renegotiation available. "You can't just—" "I already did." I heard her breath catch. And then faintly in the background voices. Margaret's among them. 4 days. My wife had been at her mother's house for 4 days, and she was taking the call about the end of our marriage with an audience. And I heard the shift. I want to describe this precisely because it was the last thing I ever needed to know about Diane Whitfield. Her voice changed. It went from cracked to composed inside a single breath, the way a woman's voice changes when she remembers who's listening. "This is not over," she said. "Yes," I said, "it is." I ended the call. You might expect the next part to be about guilt. About lying awake. About the long, difficult nights of a man interrogating his own choices. I slept like a stone. I was up at 6, at my desk by 7. By 9 I'd handled 2 client calls and marked up a contract. The world, it turned out, kept moving after I stopped carrying people who had declined to carry themselves. The texts kept coming. From Diane. From Renata, which I continued to find magnificent in its audacity. One from Trevor, which read in its entirety, "Man. I didn't think it'd go this far." I wrote back. "I did." He never answered. Cody sent something I won't repeat, not because it wounded me, but because it doesn't deserve the ink. And then, 11 days after the reunion, Lily called. "I have to tell you something," she said. "And then I have to send you something, and then I need you to not hate me." Lily, I could not hate you if I just listened, please. It came out in a rush. The 4th of July, 3 weeks before the reunion. The kitchen at the lake house. Lily on the back stairs, out of sight, doing what the youngest child in every family learns to do by the age of 9, which is to become furniture. Margaret and Harold and Renata and Diane around the island. And Lily, 24 years old, sitting on those stairs listening to her mother lay out a plan, had done something that I will be grateful for until the day I die, and that I hope she never has to explain to anyone. She'd taken out her phone and hit record. 19 minutes. She sent it that night. I want to tell you that I didn't listen to it. I did. I sat in my office at 11 at night, with the city going gold outside the window, and I listened to all 19 minutes of it twice. I'm not going to reproduce it for you. Some of it was about Harold's balloon payment, which was by then 90 days from a default that would have cost them the lake house, and, more importantly to Margaret, the story about the lake house. Some of it was Renata being Renata, which was almost restful in its consistency. Some of it was Margaret describing, in the tone of a woman planning a centerpiece, exactly how a public apology would reset the dynamic and make me, in her words, easier to talk to about certain things. And some of it, I want to be honest, and this is the part that cost me, some of it was my wife saying, in a voice I had heard say my name in the dark for 11 years, "He'll do it. He always does, and then it'll be better. He always does." That's the sentence. Out of 19 minutes, that's the one that lives in me. Not the cruelty. There wasn't much cruelty, just an accurate prediction delivered by the person who knew me best, based on 11 years of impeccable data. She wasn't wrong about who I'd been. She was only wrong about the date. The next morning I called Rebecca and told her about the recording. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me 3 questions in the flat voice of a woman who has learned not to want things on behalf of her clients. What state was it recorded in? Was Lily a party to the conversation? Would Lily testify Tennessee? One-party consent. And yes, Lily had already said yes before I asked, which is the single fact from that year that still undoes me. Marcus. Rebecca set something down on her end of the line. I want to be clear about what you're holding. This doesn't move the property division much. The structure already does that. What this does is end her father's standing in the community and put her mother's finances in a public filing. And it makes any argument Diane's attorney wants to make about your conduct impossible to make with a straight face. It's not a weapon against your wife. It's a weapon against her whole family. And it works. It works. It works completely. A pause. You should also know that if you use it, you'll be asking a 24-year-old to testify against her mother in open court. And she'll do it because she loves you. And then she'll have to go to Christmas for the rest of her life. I sat with that for 4 days. I want to be honest with you about those 4 days, because this is the part of my own story I'm least proud of and most grateful for. I did not spend them being noble. I spent them wanting it. I ran the fantasy the way you'd run a projection. Margaret's face. Harold's golf partners. The specific surgical pleasure of watching a family that had spent 11 years grading me discover that I'd had the transcript the whole time. It would have been magnificent. That's what nobody tells you about the moment you're handed the thing that would win. It isn't a temptation to do wrong. It's a temptation to do something that feels exactly like justice, that a jury would call justice, that anyone in that comment section would call justice. On the 4th day, I called Rebecca and told her to bury it, not to enter it, not to reference it, not to hint at it in a room. She said, "You understand that's money. I understand. May I ask why?" And I told her the truth, which I had only found somewhere around 3 in the morning of the 3rd day. Because that recording didn't belong to me. It belonged to a girl who had sat on a staircase and heard her family reveal itself, and had decided, alone at 24, to be a witness. She'd given it to me because she believed I was better than them. If I'd used it, I would have spent it. I would have taken the one clean thing that came out of that lake house and converted it into leverage. And Lily would have carried the cost of that transaction for the rest of her life, while I carried the proceeds. They had spent 11 years treating people as instruments. Margaret with her family portraits, Harold with his phone call in February, Diane with her renovation project. That was the family disease, and it was not contempt, and it was not cruelty. It was the belief that a person is a means. I could win that fight, or I could decline to catch it. But I could not do both. And every man who has ever told himself he'd use their methods just this once, just to settle it, just to be free of them, that man is not free of them. He's their last remaining employee. So I let it go. It cost me, by Rebecca's estimate, somewhere in the low six figures. Cheapest thing I ever bought. The proceedings moved faster than Diane expected. She'd assumed, I think, that I would slow walk it. That distance would soften me. That time would manufacture nostalgia. That I'd eventually call and suggest counseling, and we'd spend 6 months negotiating our way back to the identical arrangement with better vocabulary around it. That man had left his car in long-term parking in Nashville. Rebecca was surgical. The business held. The portfolio was structured correctly, which is another way of saying it had been structured honestly in daylight, 18 months before I had any reason to. Our home was joint and significant, and became the whole negotiation. And I gave her more of it than my attorney advised and less than her attorney demanded. And if that sounds like a compromise, it wasn't. It was a price. I paid it to be finished. Diane had good counsel, I'll grant her that. It was not a clean split. Nothing at that level ever is. But 7 months after a woman pointed her finger at my face on a porch in Tennessee, I walked out of a mediator's office in the Loop with my company intact, my future legible, and the strange, uncomplicated lightness of a man who has stopped pretending. And now I'm going to tell you the part that doesn't fit the genre. Because if I leave it out, this stops being a true story and becomes a commercial. That first winter nearly took me apart, not the divorce, the Tuesdays. Nobody warns you about the Tuesdays, the big days you brace for. You know Christmas is coming. You make a plan, you take a trip, you get through it. It's a Tuesday in February at 9:40 at night, when you reach for your phone to tell someone that the thing you'd both worried about turned out fine. And your thumb is already on the name before the rest of you remembers. And you sit there in a condo with very good light and no history in it, holding a phone, being a man in an empty room. I lost 11 years of a woman I loved. I want to be precise. I loved her. I did not love a woman who deserved it. And I have made my peace with the fact that those are two separate findings and both of them are true. I lost the way she said my name in the morning. I lost the version of her that existed only on that lake, glowing in her own water, that I got to watch, and nobody else got to watch the same way. That was real. It was the realest thing I had, and it does not become unreal because of what she did on a porch. That's the tax on honesty. You don't get to retroactively make it worthless, just because it ended badly. If it had been worthless, it wouldn't have hurt. There were nights I would have gone back. I want that on the record. For any man watching this at 1 in the morning with his jaw set, thinking he's supposed to be made of something harder. There were nights I sat with my phone in my hand and composed the text. 2 years later I found one of them saved in my drafts, and I read it, and I did not recognize the man who wrote it, and I also did not despise him. I never sent one, not because I was strong, because every time I got close, I heard 19 minutes of a kitchen in Tennessee, and a woman's voice saying, with total confidence, he always does. There's no version of going back where that sentence isn't still true. 14 months after the reunion, the company had added 6 properties. I'd promoted 2 people who'd earned it, hired a director of operations, and taken my first weekend off in 4 years without the world ending, which was its own small humiliation. Discovering the thing you'd been indispensable to had simply been waiting for you to delegate. I know how thoroughly I was being watched, because Renata told Diane, and Diane told Lily. And Lily told me with a kind of horrified amusement that Diane had been tracking my professional activity online, the way you press on a bruise to confirm it's still there. Her attorney made one last attempt to claim a portion of the company's recent growth. Rebecca's response was so thoroughly documented that it ended the conversation in a single session. She sent me a 2-word email afterward. Handled. Nothing. I heard through Lily, who remained and remains the one functional human being that family produced, that Margaret was telling people I was struggling, that I'd gone off the rails, that the business was probably going under. I found this genuinely delightful, and I want to explain why, because it isn't spite. People who mistake your patience for weakness build an entire architecture on that mistake. Years of it, load-bearing, and when you walk away, they cannot simply update the file, because the file is the house. They need you to be struggling. They need the man who left to be crawling somewhere quietly, just out of frame. It confirms the version of events in which they were right, and you were difficult, in which the porch was a regrettable blip, in an otherwise loving relationship, rather than the verdict it actually was. I wasn't crawling, I was building. And they had to keep telling that story anyway, forever, to each other. At that lake, in that house, which incidentally they did lose. 18 months after the reunion. The balloon payment came due exactly the way arithmetic promised it would. And no one appeared to solve it, because the only person who had ever been willing to sit down with their lender for free had been asked to leave. I want to be clear that I take no pleasure in that. I mean it. When Lily told me, I sat in my office and felt nothing that resembled triumph. What I felt was something closer to grief, for a February phone call in the 9th year, when a proud man asked me for help, in a language he couldn't afford to speak plainly. And I answered in a language he couldn't afford to hear. I have wondered genuinely for years now whether I should have just written the check. And I've landed here, no. But not for the reason I would have given you at the time. Not because they hadn't earned it. Because a check would have bought me exactly what they were selling, which was conditional belonging, at a price that reset every year. They didn't want my money, they wanted my need. Money was just how I was supposed to pay for the privilege of being needed by people who had never once needed me. The last piece happened 18 months after that porch, at an industry event in Nashville, of all the cities on earth. Property development conference. 3 days, decent connections, useful conversation. Second evening, rooftop reception, 200 people. And I walked into a cluster near the bar and found Preston Cole standing there with a drink in his hand. And the expression of a man who would rather have been anywhere else on the planet, including inside the building's ventilation system. We looked at each other for a moment that lasted approximately forever. "Marcus," he said. "Preston," a beat. And then to his credit he said, "You look well." "I am well." He nodded, looked into his glass. "Listen, I want to say I didn't agree with how that weekend went. I want you to know that. I've thought about it a lot, actually." I studied him. Preston Cole, 46 years old, married into that family 2 years before I was, drinking a gin and tonic on a roof in Nashville, still doing the arithmetic that keeps a man on the correct side of Renata Whitfield's opinion. You were there, Preston. I know. You didn't say a word. He had the decency to look genuinely ashamed. I know that too, and I could have taken it. I want you to understand that the option was fully available and would have cost me nothing. I could have been gracious, shaken his hand, told him it was a long time ago. Let him carry his drink back to whatever conversation he'd come from, feeling 1 degree lighter about the man he'd watched get sentenced on a porch. That's what the old Marcus would have done. The one who sealed the basement. The one who drove to the airport at 2 in the morning. The one who attended 14 consecutive reunions and poured his own coffee. I appreciate you saying it, I told him. I do. But I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty. I watched him hear his sister-in-law's sentence come back at him, across 8 months and a rooftop. An apology that costs nothing delivered after the fact isn't an apology. It's maintenance. You're not making it right. You're making it easier to carry. He didn't say anything. I'm not angry at you, Preston. I want you to know that, and I mean it. But you didn't need to agree with them. You just needed to speak once out loud at a table in front of people. That's all it ever took. I picked up my drink. That's all it would have taken from any of you. I left him there, and I went and had a genuinely excellent conversation about mixed-use zoning with a woman from Charlotte, and I have not thought about Preston Cole more than a handful of times since. Now let me tell you what I actually learned, because I've had 4 years to sit with it, and the story is not the lesson. The story is just the delivery vehicle. Nobody tells you the truth about choosing yourself, so here it is. It isn't loud. It doesn't look like the movie. The strings don't swell, and the room doesn't realize it was wrong. It's a man packing a bag while his wife studies a floorboard. It's a one-way ticket booked in 3 taps. It's a phone face down on a passenger seat. It's quiet and unglamorous, and it happens while everyone else is eating a cookie. And the revenge, yes, I'll use the word. I'm done pretending it was anything else, was never a single moment. There was no scene. I never got to say the perfect thing. The revenge was a sustained choice, repeated every morning, to spend my one finite life on something that was actually mine. But here's the first thing I'd want you to take, if you take anything. There's a difference between patience and erasure, and it is almost impossible to see from the inside, because they feel identical while you're doing them. Both look like restraint, both feel like maturity, Both let you tell yourself you're the bigger person. The difference is direction. Patience is when you're waiting for something to grow. Erasure is when you're waiting for something to stop hurting. If you've been telling yourself for years that you're being patient, ask yourself one question and answer it honestly. What, specifically, are you waiting to see grow? And when did you last see it move? I couldn't answer that in year 4. I answered it anyway for 7 more years, because the alternative was a war I didn't want and a truth I couldn't afford. The second thing, silence is a position. This is the one that took me 11 years and a divorce to learn, and I'd give a great deal to have known it at 32. Diane never insulted me, not once in 11 years. She didn't have to. She was standing next to the people who did, and that's the same thing. And everyone at that table understood it perfectly, including me, which is why I looked at her every single time. When someone diminishes a person in front of you, and you say nothing, you have not stayed neutral. You have voted. You cast a ballot for the version of the room where that behavior is acceptable, and the person being diminished counted it. They always count it. Neutrality is not available in the room, it's only available in the retelling. If you love someone, speak while it costs you something. That's the whole job. An apology on a rooftop 18 months later is not the job. Trevor stood up when there was nothing left to save, and Lily hit record when she had everything to lose. And one of those is love, and one of those is grief, and I know which one I'd want from my own child. The third thing, and this is the one I actually want you to keep, because it's the reason I've told you all of it. Winning and healing are not the same road, and at some point you will be forced to choose. I had 19 minutes of audio that would have ended them. Not hurt them, ended them. And what I've learned is that the moment you're handed that thing, it doesn't feel like a temptation to do evil. It feels like justice. It feels earned. Everyone would have agreed. That's what makes it dangerous. Nobody is ever tempted by a bad argument. But I would have had to become an instrument user to use it. I'd have had to look at Lily, the only person in 11 years who did the right thing at cost, and see a piece of evidence. That is precisely what they did to me. That's what they did to each other. That was the disease in that house. And it wasn't cruelty. It was the quiet conviction that people are for something. You do not get free of people like that by defeating them. You get free of them by declining to become them, which is slower and quieter, and nobody applauds, and it costs actual money. Margaret wanted me to beg, Diane wanted me to come back, Renata wanted me to struggle, Harold wanted me to be an asset. Cody, I still have no idea what Cody wanted, and I hope he found it. They each needed a specific performance from me, and I declined to provide any of them. They gave me 2 options. I took the third. And here's what I think about now, on the good mornings, when the coffee's right and the city's just waking up outside my window. They thought the third option was leaving. It wasn't. Leaving is easy. Leaving is a car and a highway and a gate at an airport. The third option was refusing to spend the rest of my life prosecuting them. It was declining to become a man whose whole architecture is a lake house in Tennessee he never has to visit again. The third option was not looking back, and I mean that as a discipline, not a mood. Every morning. On purpose. For years. 14 reunions. 14 summers. 14 years of pouring my own coffee at a table where I'd earned a place I was never going to be given. They spent all of it making me invisible. And in the end, I didn't make them disappear. I want to correct that, because I said it for a while. And it was a good line, and it was a lie. They're still out there. They're fine. They're having a reunion somewhere smaller this summer. What actually happened is simpler, and better, and took longer. I stopped needing to be seen by people who had already decided not to look. If any of this landed, if you're the person in the room right now, pouring your own coffee, telling yourself it's fine, telling yourself you're being patient, do me one favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to my channel, because these stories only reach the people who need them when you do. And leave a comment telling me about the moment you first knew. Not the moment you left, the moment you knew. I read them, everyone. That's not a line either. Everything you've heard here was written by a human being, at a desk, over a long period of time, thinking about it. Nothing about this story was generated for you. The names have been changed and certain details altered, as they must be, because real people are entitled to their privacy, even when they haven't earned it. But the shape is true, and the ache is true, and the 4 days I spent wanting to use that recording were true. And I've told you about them because I think a story where the narrator is only ever good isn't a story. It's an advertisement. I don't know your family. I don't know what your porch looks like, or who's standing on the wrong side of your room. I only know mine, and I've told it as honestly as I can, and I've probably been unfair to Diane in at least 3 places without knowing which ones. Take what's useful. Leave the rest by the water.